In my last, I talked about trying to make our democratic institutions and practices function in a way that will ensure that we get government for the people, good enough government, what Aristotle called sufficient government. And I talked there about how important it is that those processes should really reflect the great diversity of interests and preferences that exist in an electorate. And I also mentioned that it is, of course, desirable that if we want government to be by the people, that phrase, the people, should really mean as big a slice of the population as it possibly can. So let's have a look at a couple of these thoughts. Let's look at the fact that in the UK and the US, the system of voting which is used in order to populate the House of Commons and the House of Representatives in America's Congress is the so-called first past the post voting system, otherwise known as the plurality voting system. This is a system in which in every constituency or congressional district, the person who gets the most votes goes to Parliament or Congress. And on the face of it, that looks perfectly sensible. But alas, it only works if there are just two and only two candidates standing for election in a constituency. Because think of this. Supposing you have a constituency of 100 voters and 10 people offer themselves for election, 8 of whom get 10 votes each, 1 of whom gets 9 votes, and the last of whom gets 11 votes. Now, the person who gets 11 votes has got more votes than any other individual candidate, and is therefore the person who goes to Parliament, representing just 11 people out of 100. And this is what happens very, very often. In many constituencies, the person who gets sent to Parliament does so on a minority of the votes cast. Now that, by any stretch of the imagination, is not democratic. Things are worse, because when you sum up the overall effect of this, is that we get governments in the United Kingdom, and as we see in the case of at least 2, perhaps 3 of the last presidential elections in the United States of America, that we get governments, executives, on a minority of the vote. In December 2019, the Conservative Party won the general election with a massive majority of 80 seats on 43% of the votes, of the actual votes cast, representing just under 29% of the total electorate. Now, in our system, a majority of seats in the House of Commons gives complete power to the executive, to the government. It does so because the executive controls the majority. It's drawn from the majority in the House of Commons. It controls it through the whips, so it has an automatic rubber stamp for its policies, given the system that we have at the moment, and that is something we need to look at separately as well. The debates in the House of Commons therefore turn out to be a kind of empty theatre, because they make very little difference to the outcome of what happens when legislation is passed. And yet this 100% of power, which is handed to whatever party gets a majority of seats, even if it's a majority of 1, is based on a minority of the votes cast and on an absolute minority of the total electorate. Just in itself, these considerations should give us serious pause. If you had a system of proportional representation, now there are many different schemes of proportional representation, a lot of debate about them. It has been shown, I think, and convincingly argued that the single transferable vote system or the extra member system tends to work rather well and achieve the effect required, which is that representation should be much more proportional. In such a system, it's very likely that no single party is going to have an overall majority in the legislature unless it is really genuinely popular with and desired by the majority of the population. And that means that government will have to be coalition government. And in my view, that is a very, very good thing, because coalition governments, despite the fact that there has to be a lot of horse trading and discussion and compromise and some smaller parties agreeing with the larger parties on certain things that they might not otherwise agree on, so that they can get their own items put on the agenda. But the overall result is going to be much more consensual government, much more compromise, much more moderate, much more centrist government. And when you think about the last part of the definition of democracy, government for the people, meaning the whole population, everybody, not just the people who happen to vote for one particular party, then you can see that there is a very great advantage in that. In fact, we've got a very recent example of this. Between the elections of 2017, Theresa May called that election, and the election of 2019, we had, in effect, a hung parliament in the United Kingdom. And in that hung parliament, every single thing that the government of the day wished to do, it had to argue for and convince on the floor of the House of Commons, case by case, item by item. It was scrutinized by and held to account by a parliament which was not just an automatic vote-giving machine for the government of the day because of a majority or because of the whips. And that, as you can see, is a very good thing. That is how democracy should be. And when you look at countries where there is proportional representation, you see, and this is verifiable, it's in the public domain, you can check for yourself, much more consistent government and much more flourishing economies. By no means perfect. It's not that there aren't arguments and difficulties and sometimes early elections and so on, but something which is in the view of anybody who makes the comparison between a first past the post voting system and a proportional system, something much more desirable. So I would argue that the very first thing, and it's a very achievable thing, that we would require in what I described in an earlier talk as the Westminster model of democracies that don't yet have proportional representation, is a reform of our electoral system. That one thing by itself would make a real difference, a big step towards government for the people, a much more democratic, a much more effective form of representative democracy than the one that we have in the UK and the US, and in those other countries like India, Canada, and a number of others, which follow the same model and have the same unsatisfactory voting system.